Ed and Lorraine Warren meet with the Lutz family in the famous Amityville house. A year earlier, Ronald DeFeo, Jr. had murdered his family with a shotgun, and the Lutzes claim to have experienced paranormal phenomena. During a seance, Lorraine has a vision in which she sees herself in Ronald's place on the night of the crimes. In the vision, she herself commits the murders, first against Ronald's parents and then against his siblings. Later, Lorraine confronts a demonic creature that takes the form of a nun, followed by the image of a dying man. Lorraine screams, and Ed pulls her out of the vision to calm her down. A year later, in Enfield, England, Janet Hodgson is sitting outside the school with her friend Camilla, who is smoking a cigarette. Camilla hands it to Janet just as a teacher discovers them and scolds them for smoking. The teacher confiscates the cigarette and takes a puff. Janet lives with her older sister Margaret, her younger brothers Johnny and Billy, and her mother Peggy. The Hodgson family faces financial difficulties, as the father left them for a neighbor, and Billy has a speech problem that makes him suffer at school. Peggy struggles with her insecurities as a single mother. One night, while Janet and Margaret are sleeping in their room, Janet begins to feel a disturbing presence. She seems to be talking to herself, but then responds with a deep and rough voice that says, "This is my house." Margaret thinks Janet is joking, until Janet stands next to her bed and an aged male voice repeats the same phrase. Margaret turns on the light, but finds no one. She decides to sleep with the light on. Back in the United States, the Warrens appear on a talk show to discuss the Amityville case. Another guest on the show dismisses the case as a fraud and questions Lorraine's alleged clairvoyance, which sparks a heated argument with Ed. Lorraine manages to calm him down backstage. Meanwhile, in England, Janet and Billy play with a record player that plays the melody of "There Was a Crooked Man." When going to sleep, Janet ties her arm to the bed, but ends up on the living room floor without knowing how she got there. Billy, while walking through the house, finds a toy fire truck on the floor. He pushes it towards a closet in the hallway, but shortly after, the truck rolls back into his room. Billy pushes it again, but this time he hears a chilling moan and flees to his mother's room. Meanwhile, Margaret hears knocks on her door, but when she opens it, she finds no one. Janet appears and denies having been knocking. The next day, Janet is watching television when the channels start changing by themselves. The remote control has disappeared, and when she looks for it, she finds it on a chair behind her. Suddenly, a ghostly figure emerges from the corner and growls, "My house." Janet screams and runs back to the couch. "My house!" That night, Janet wakes up on the floor of her room, as if she had been thrown out of bed. She tells Margaret that there is someone in the house. Before Margaret can dismiss it, the beds begin to shake violently. Both scream and run to Peggy's room, who initially thinks they are playing, until a dresser is forcefully pushed against the door. The Hodgsons take refuge in the house of their neighbors, the Nottinghams. Peggy calls the police to check her house. The officers don't find anything at first, but then they see a chair slide across the room by itself, which leaves them terrified. At the Warren house, Ed is painting a picture of the demonic nun that Lorraine saw in her vision. Later, while Lorraine and her daughter Judy are in the living room, they hear a noise in the hallway. Judy goes out to investigate and is horrified to see the demon nun. Lorraine follows her to the office, where she thinks she sees the nun in the darkness, but it's just the painting. However, the demon is present and makes the painting come to life. The nun growls and lunges at Lorraine, who has another vision. This time she sees Ed dying, saying, "I'm sorry, Lorraine," before a wooden stake pierces him. Lorraine begins to scream and scribble in her Bible until Judy brings her out of that state. In Enfield, the news about the phenomena in the Hodgson house spreads quickly, attracting the attention of several paranormal investigators, including Maurice Gross and Anita Gregory. Anita is skeptical, arguing that there is not enough evidence to confirm that the events are truly paranormal. Maurice, along with a news team, gathers at the Hodgson house to interview Janet and Margaret. During the interview, Janet begins to act strangely and speaks with a hoarse and aged voice, identifying herself as Bill Wilkins, a 72-year-old man who demands that everyone leave his home. Meanwhile, at the Nottingham house, where the children are sleeping in the living room, Billy ventures through the house and encounters a creature that takes the form of the Twisted Man, reciting the children's rhyme in a terrifying manner. The creature chases Billy, who runs to tell his mother and the others. At that moment, Janet appears with the same eerie voice, reciting the rhyme and emitting a chilling sound that shatters the room's glass. Then, she faints and starts to drool. At the Warren house, a priest presents them with a recording of the interview with Janet and asks them to help with the case. Lorraine, still affected by the vision of Ed's death, expresses her doubts, but Ed believes that perhaps she is destined to prevent that future. They decide to travel to England to investigate. Upon arriving in Enfield, the Warrens meet the Hodgson family. Peggy shows them the wrecked bedroom, with the walls covered in crosses, and they decide to seal the room with a chain. Lorraine meets Janet outside, sitting on a swing. Janet expresses her sadness because people avoid her due to the supposed paranormal phenomena. Lorraine comforts her, telling her that one person can make a difference, just as Ed has done for her. Janet warns that the voice she hears wants to harm Lorraine. The Warrens, along with Maurice and other investigators, gather in the Hodgsons' living room to try to communicate with the spirit. Janet, sitting in a chair, begins to speak with the voice of Bill Wilkins once the adults turn their backs. Ed takes out his cross necklace and places it in front of Janet, causing Bill to sound distressed and scream something unintelligible before everything calms down. Finally, the Warrens discuss the evidence with the other investigators. Anita remains the most skeptical, believing that Janet is faking everything. Ed also seems to have his doubts, but Lorraine insists that there is something more at play. The Warrens spend the night at the Hodgsons' house. Janet finds herself in the bedroom full of crosses, which suddenly begin to turn upside down. The ghost of Bill Wilkins attacks Janet, causing her to scream desperately. The adults, alerted by the screams, rush to unlock the door and manage to get Janet out safely. On another occasion, Peggy takes Ed to the basement to inspect a water problem that has left the place flooded. While they are there, Peggy thinks she sees someone behind Ed, but it is actually the ghostly apparition of Bill Wilkins, who emerges from the water and grabs Peggy. Ed manages to free her and helps her out of the basement. Over time, the children begin to grow fond of the Warrens during their stay. Peggy mentions that her ex-husband took all the music from the house, so Ed decides to buy an Elvis record for the children to listen to. However, the record player stops working. Without getting discouraged, Ed picks up a guitar and starts playing "Can't Help Falling in Love with You." Additionally, he gives the children a piece of advice: never let bullies discourage you. Lorraine has a private conversation with Maurice. He tells her that they are about to become part of history, something Lorraine doesn't quite understand. Maurice reveals that he lost his daughter years ago and that he has been waiting for the opportunity to communicate with her in some way, if that is possible. On another night, the children hear strange noises coming from the kitchen. Johnny decides to investigate, determined to confront what he calls a bully. Meanwhile, Margaret screams upon realizing that Janet has disappeared. Janet reappears in the kitchen, holding a knife and the door lock. The adults try to enter, but things start flying through the air. When they finally manage to get in, they find chairs and plates scattered all over the kitchen, but Johnny and Janet are nowhere to be found. After a search, they find Johnny and discover Janet trapped inside an electrical box, speaking in an unintelligible voice before being rescued. Anita presents the Warrens with video evidence showing Janet throwing objects in the kitchen to simulate a possession, suggesting that she was faking it. This leads Peggy to expel everyone from the house. Later, when the children also express their doubts about Janet, she confesses to them that the entity would have harmed her family if they hadn't obeyed its orders. The Warrens board the train to return home, although Lorraine still feels uncertain about how Janet seemed to act when she was in front of the camera. Ed, however, reviews the recordings of Bill Wilkins' voice and realizes that the messages are connected. When played together, they decipher that Bill was saying, "Help me. He won't let me go." This leads Lorraine to have another vision. In it, she sees the real Bill Wilkins, no longer threatening, sitting in his chair. Bill speaks in a riddle to Lorraine before the demon nun appears behind him and takes him away. Lorraine then understands that Bill was just a pawn and that the true enemy is the demon. They decide to quickly return to the Hodgson house to solve the puzzle. Ed deduces that Bill meant they need to discover the demon's name to have power over it. Upon returning, they find the family trapped outside the house in a torrential rain. Ed tries to enter through the back, but a lightning bolt strikes a tree in front of the house, leaving a sharp branch that Lorraine recognizes as the object that kills Ed in her vision. Desperate, Lorraine tries to discover the name of the demon and realizes that she already knows it. She looks in her Bible and sees that, among her scribbles, the name is written, Valak. Run to the house to help Ed. Inside, Ed is partially blinded when a pipe bursts and sprays steam in his face. As he stumbles, he is attacked by the Twisted Man. He manages to reach the room where Janet is, who is next to a window that breaks, leaving a dangerous opening. Janet almost falls, but Ed reaches her just in time, grabbing onto some curtains that start to tear. Lorraine arrives in the room and tries to save Ed, but Valak appears and stops her. At a crucial moment, Lorraine utters the demon's name, condemning it back to hell. Then, she runs to save Ed and Janet at the last moment. Janet remains unharmed. The next morning, everything is calm. Peggy and Janet thank the Warrens for their help. A brief text explains that the Enfield possession case became one of the most famous in history. Peggy Hodgson continued living in the house for 40 years until her death, which occurred in the same chair where Bill Wilkins died. The Warrens return home. Ed places the record player of the Crooked Man in his museum, right in front of Annabelle. As he does so, he hears music coming from upstairs. It's Lorraine, who has put on the song Can't Help Falling in Love by Elvis Presley. They both share a dance, sealing a moment of tranquility after the storm.